CUTS International has undertaken a biennial research program entitled Competition Regulation and Development Research Forum (CDRF) to simulate research and deliberations on competition and regulatory implementation issues cycle, with the first research cycle being organized on the theme of institutional issues covering political economy and governance constraints in implementing regulatory regimes in the developing world. The first research cycle was supported by the Department for International Development (DFID) UK and International Development Research Centre (IDRC) Canada. An international research symposium was organized on 22nd to 24th March 2007 at New Delhi, India, to deliberate on research findings that emerged in the first research cycle. About 100 participants took part in the symposium that comprised academicians, practitioners, policymakers from developing countries, regulators, civil servants and other stakeholders. Mr. Pradeep Mehta of CUTS International delivered the welcome address.
Support which UNCTAD has been providing to CUTS over a long time, from which let me draw the history of CUTS in the area of trade and competition, and I'll take about 5 minutes in this welcome remark. I think it is important for a large number of people who may not be aware as to why are we organizing this particular research symposium as a part of a research project.
After the welcome address, Mr. Roger Nellist of DFID UK addressed the audience.
Parts of the world as well. We are very pleased to be co-sponsoring with the IDRC of Canada this particular event and the research program, and to be partnering with CUTS.
Dr. C. Rangarajan, Chairman, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, delivered his observations.
Additionally, most of the countries have adopted regulatory roles in several sectors, opened up for private parties, which were hitherto reserved only for the public sector.
Dr. Nitin Desai, former Under-Secretary General of United Nations, addressed that it is very important that the Indian government undertake both political and economic democracy together for the better economic growth and competitive environment, and also to safeguard the interest of the consumer. Dr. Supachai Panichipakri, Secretary General of UNCTAD, said that UNCTAD helps developing countries on domestic regulation in order to ensure that their developmental and institutional needs are adequately reflected in any disciplines that might be adopted. This means that in all essential service sectors, strong national leadership to formulate and implement country strategies must be backed by international donor assistance.
Around the world. Because we would like to think and believe that whatever we do to promote more globalization and liberalization, it will be in the benefits of the consumers.
Mr. Frederick Jenny, Judge, French Supreme Court, said in his observation.
In developing countries, they were, I think, undertaken for two main reasons. One of them was the desire and the hope that they would increase the efficiency of the production systems of the developing countries, and therefore promote economic growth, which was much needed. So that was one objective, efficiency and growth.
The second day of the symposium had 4 sessions to follow. Session first was dedicated to the theme Political Economy, Constraints in Competition and Regulatory Regimes. Mr. Pierre Jacquet, Agence Française de Développement, AFD, and Mr. R. Shyam Kimani, the World Bank Group USA, chaired the session.
This is the first introductory session of this seminar on political economic constraints in competition and regulatory regimes. This is the general topic of political economy forces creating obstacles to the effective implementation of competition policy.
In light of the discussions that we had. Another question I'd like the panel to think about is that whenever one has economic crisis, one has policy changes. Certainly in India in 1991, the economic crisis led to the introduction of liberalized reforms. What is the nature of the crisis that leads to enactment of competition law?
The first paper was presented by Mr. Max Everest Phillips of DFID UK on tackling the tyranny of vested interests, competition policy as political governance.
Of allies and opponents of reforming competition policy to pick politically feasible but relevant fights that take on vested interests that are big enough to matter politically, but not politically so dominant as to kill off reform prospects.
The second paper was presented by Mr. Thula Keira of Zambia Competition Commission on identifying and overcoming political economy and governance constraints to effective implementation of cooperation and regulatory laws in Zambia.
The efficacy and extent of regulatory reform is a function of the level of the economic, political, and social dynamics in a country, whereas the cornerstone of new development, the new development paradigm is a private sector-led economy. The challenge to deregulate and reform becomes unique in a developing country, which may have a lack of the rule of law, for instance, and weak institutional structures to offer checks and balances that are relevant in any regulatory environment.
Third paper was presented by Mr. Pradeep Mehta, Secretary General CUTS International, on Journey of India's New Competition Law Through a Practitioner's Eye.
My presentation is of sort of kind of a historical note on the evolution of the competition law in India as a practitioner stakeholder. As I mentioned yesterday in the opening session, we've been involved with the competition regime scenario since we were founded. In fact, it was one of the reasons for our founding itself. The Monopolies and Restricted Trade Practices Act. The experience with the MRTP Act was pretty sad, as we have seen both from speakers as well as generally. The intent was never put into practice. On the contrary, the MRTP Act was drafted in a scenario where there was a heavy dominance of state planning, control and command regime.
Mr. Peter Njorge of Monopolies and Prices Commission, Kenya, Mr. Pranab Bardhan of University of California, Berkeley, USA, Mr. Scott Jacob of Jacobs & Associates, USA, and Mr. Thankam Arun of University of Manchester, UK, as discussants expressed their views.
It's part of a much broader concept of political leadership of transformation. And that actually requires a sense of ideals and visions amongst political leaders about what they want, which is more than economic efficiency gains. It's about real empowerment. It's about real transition. And one of the optimistic things, and I agree entirely about the enormous shortcomings of new institutional economics, that actually there are, encouragingly, many political leaders around the developing world who do, I think, have this vision. We had a very interesting discussion yesterday about Thailand. And so the question is, to what extent can we see and help political leaders, I mean, first of all, help in educating political leaders as to why these issues matter, why they have broader impacts, why they do, why these issues can make a significant difference, and how then they build up these growth coalitions, because it's true that elites and vested interests are not homogeneous by any means, and that is why change tends to happen. It doesn't tends to happen because of revolution or outside. It's because elites start seeing changes of interest.
For us, sadly, we define poverty in a way that means that there are very many people. We look at a definition of people who live on less than $1 a day, and that means that in a country like India there are several 100 million people who live in poverty. So we're not talking about a small minority, and this would be true in Africa as well, where in many African societies there's a considerable percentage of the population who live in poverty.
Last year, a few of us tried to draw out, where possible, the links between competition law and policy and the Millennium Development Goals. And in a presentation before a number of enforcement officials, one of them reacted, the acting chief economist of the US Department of Justice, by saying that the only economics that he knows links enforcement actions to efficiency, and that's
by competition and regulatory agencies. Mr. Frederick Jenny chaired the said session.
Criteria, I mean, what can one say about that to be as effective as possible? And of course also, what is the criteria for being effective? And the second issue on the effectiveness will be the relationship between competition authority and regulatory authority.
Ms. Valentina Zogby of International Bar Association UK presented on strategic priorities of competition and regulation agencies in developing countries.
International experience. It is also important to acknowledge that these challenges vary depending on the level of development of the agency And in order to overcome these challenges, competition agencies should look at strategies that have been adopted by other agencies in more developed countries in managing similar challenges.
Mr. Usal Sabaz of Turkish Competition Authority spoke on the issue of conflict between regulation and competition agencies, lessons from experience of Turkey. The third session was dedicated to efficiency and effectiveness of competition and regulatory agencies. The chair for this session was Mr. George Lipmele of Zambia Competition Commission.
They don't need an introduction, but just maybe in case. Immediately on my left, it is Alan Asher of Energy Watch UK. He was also with the Australian Competition Authority, if I had to recall. Next to Alan is Eleanor Fox. She's a guru in this subject matter. I've listened to her several times and I've met her at a lot of these forums.
Mr. J. Louis Gauche of World Bank USA made the first presentation on Does Regulation and Institutional Design Matter for Infrastructure Sector Performance?
The motivation behind this work goes very well with what we said this morning. We talk about, again, these agencies and autonomy, the like, and so on. But ultimately, what we want to make sure is that all these things that we're discussing, really is worth discussing.
Following that, Ms. Olivia Jensen of London School of Economics, UK, made her presentation on the role of regulatory agencies in developing countries, a game theoretic approach to the regulation of public-private contracts.
Let's begin with a very basic question. What's this regulation? Do we need it? Do we need regulators? One point of view is that regulators, economic regulators in sectors like water or other infrastructure sectors, is that they're basically transitional. You need a regulator while competition is created in the market. But while that might be the case perhaps in the telecoms arena, perhaps to some extent in power generation, it doesn't seem to be the case in the water sector. And that's because the water sector has extremely strong, kind of typical natural monopoly characteristics.
Michael Nicholson of University of Maryland, USA presented on Technical Assistance for Law and Economics, an empirical analysis in antitrust competition policy.
And of all the new nascent agencies around the world, there's been obviously a significant amount of TA, or technical assistance, over the past 10, 15 years, going back 40 years. One sort of update to your program is that I've since moved to Transylvania University from the University of Maryland, which is located in Kentucky. And when I told my colleagues in Kentucky I was coming all the way to New Delhi but wasn't going to have a chance to see the Taj Mahal, I reassured them that CUTS was the Taj Mahal of research on competition policy. So I'm happy to do that. Also, recognition to my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, my co-authors on this paper, Danny Sokol and Kyle Stigert. This graph right here, some of you may recognize from some of the previous ICN analysis, shows the growth of competition policy, or the number of jurisdictions with competition regimes from between 1990 and 2005, and obviously it's been updated since 2005, particularly with China, where red indicates countries that, or jurisdictions that have actually adopted competition laws of some sort.
A discussion was followed by participants together with discussants, which comprised of Mr. Alan Asher of Energy Watch UK, Eleanor Fox, New York School of Law, USA, Joseph Seon-Hyo of Yoon Yang Kimchi and U, South Korea, and Simon Ebenett, University of St. Gallen, Switzerland.
This casts a different light on the papers that we've seen this afternoon, all of which are very commendable, but I think you'll see that they represent only a small fraction of the progress that we could make in this area in the years ahead if more research is undertaken.
For infrastructure performance. And the paper divides that into three specific areas of inquiry. It's about aligning the costs with tariffs and profitability, about looking at the opportunities for renegotiation or failure of the regulatory contract, or those where there are problems in quality, coverage and price.
The conference last year in Cape Town, I recall that. But the most important limitation to your proposal is that also in donor positions we do not have enough money and enough time, and also we do have very scarce expertise.
Other finding which is important is that technical assistance is most effective when the agency could trace its role to expanding the output of particular services. This is a very practical and functional bit of finding, and I think one can draw advice from it. And also that technical assistance appears to work best when change is needed and is being stifled, and perhaps donors could target those situations.
More and more, it's also very big business for a lot of people. So measuring TA and the effect of TA is, I think, quite a sensitive topic. But I'd like to understand your results a bit better. I have questions about your robustness checks, if you've made any. Because basically you throw on the right-hand side a whole bunch of variables which are institutional variables, and I'm afraid they must be all correlated with each other. So don't you have, especially with a small sample of 38 observations, don't you have problems of multicollinearity, which means that isolating the effect of your different variables may be a bit difficult?
Created from the moment these regulatory agencies were created, or it was an afterthought, because availability of uniform set of data can really have the consequences of the performance or any other studies that we want to do on that. So my comment is that how do we learn from the experience in Latin America on the putting together the relevant knowledge and information on these industries from day one.
Session 4 was focused on competition and regulatory regimes in small economies. Mr. Nitin Desai, former Under-Secretary General of United Nations, chaired the session, and Lino Briguglio of University of Malta presented his paper on competition policies in small jurisdictions.
Competition from abroad. When we entered the EU and all the markets were open, the same case would have been decided differently. So that's a very important issue, especially for small jurisdictions.
Mr. Cecily Sampson, Regulatory Governance Advisor to the Government of Jamaica, presented his paper, Competition and Regulatory Institutional Structures in Microstates, the Case of the Caribbean.
I recognize these limitations because some of my university colleagues at the University of the West Indies, where I lecture competition and regulatory law, brought these to my attention, and one was the generality of the two typologies.
A discussion was held after the presentation with discussants comprising of Mr. Colin Kirkpatrick of University of Manchester, UK, Michael Gall of University of Haifa, Israel, and Pierre Jacques of Agence Française de Développement, France.
It's about the priority set for each competition authority, and I find it a very interesting presentation. I have a very small comment. I think it would be interesting to study the relationship between the priorities on one hand and the goals and needs and capabilities of each competition authority.
The last day of the symposium was dedicated to country and sectoral case studies. The session was chaired by Mr. Pranab Bardhan of the University of California, Berkeley, USA, and Mr. Suman Bere of National Council of Applied Economics and Research, India. Mr. Norman Litigu Shitote of Kenya presented his paper on Institutions and Effectiveness of Competition Policies and Regulatory Regime in Kenya.
In the implementation of these regulatory systems. Another motivation for this study was the performance of the new regulatory regime in Kenya, which has remained under-researched. As we talk now, we have very few NGOs that are doing research in terms of regulatory and competition authorities. The main question that we are asking was, what are the institutional issues in the effectiveness of competition policy and regulatory systems in Kenya?
Mr. S. Chakravarti, Advisor, Competition Policy and Law, India, presented his paper on the tripod of independence, expertise and accountability on a regulator, an analysis of Indian competition policy and law. Mr. Frank Nyaert of Hogeschool Ghent, Belgium, presented his paper on credibility and independence in Belgium competition and regulatory policies. Mr. Cassie Lee of Nottingham University Business School, Malaysia, Mr. John Preston of DFID UK, Mr. Marwan Kardouche of Jordan Centre for Public Policy Research and Dialogue, Jordan, had been the discussants.
Any solutions on design and implementation do need to be country specific. It was very heartening to see the conclusions in the Kenya paper that Kenya has developed its own model and has been quite successful in implementing policies to restrict anti-competitive behaviour.
The sixth session of the symposium was designed as a combined session in which sectoral case studies were discussed. The combined session was chaired by Mr. A.K. Basu of Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, India, Mr. D.R. Mehta, former Chairman, Securities and Exchange Board of India, and Mr. B.K. Juchi, former Deputy Chairman, Telecom Regulatory Authority of India.
In the context of banking sector in India, the main point of my presentation will be that banking scene in India is at such a stage now that if competition is to go any further, then it will be required that there are significant improvements of working of the public sector banks. And unless these are carried out, it will be difficult to even maintain competition in the banking sector.
And these banks are unable to compete, particularly in the way this labor market has gone. But on the other hand, there is this other distortion, which is that the public sector banks have infinite guarantees by the government, whereas every other bank has a 100,000 rupee deposit insurance. So it is a very awkward market, and I think that we need to think out of the box in terms of breaking with this gridlock and in terms of achieving improved competition.
At times have to recognize that when you are talking of foreign banks, there has to be a principle of reciprocity. If your banks are not allowed to operate there, then how do you expect their banks to operate here? I mean, the restrictions would be of different types. They may keep the threshold limit so high that no Indian bank can enter.
The concluding session was chaired by Mr. Bimal Jalan, former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He underscored the important distinction between regulation and control and hoped that the former does not degenerate into the latter.
India participates, South Africa participates, Brazil participates.
In the concluding session, Mr. Evan Dew of IDRC addressed the audience.
This particular project is about political economy of regulatory regimes, and I think that's an important departure from other particular fora. And I think that sets it apart, and I think in terms of the work that's gone on here, there's a real gap that needs to be filled by empirical research.
In this context, the cross-cutting themes that emerged in the symposium were as follows. A. Political will is a necessary condition for establishing effective competition regimes. B. Consumer advocacy and empowerment is crucial since it will provide countervailing force to existing producer interests. C. Creation of competition culture. D. One size does not fit all. Developing countries' context is different from developed countries, and therefore customization is necessary. The symposium provided an opportunity for reflection on a wider range of views particularly important for developing countries. The papers and deliberations at the symposium will help identifying approaches that could be useful for developing countries in tackling the various political economic constraints.